everyone. I'm Dr. Yashoda Tade. I'm a second year postgraduate at Shankar Nethralaya. I welcome you all to the 31st edition of Powwow. The subspecialty for the month of April is glaucoma. I now hand over to Mona Khurana ma'am to introduce our presenters and our panelists.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to yet another episode of Powwow. We have very interesting presentations by our glaucoma alumni and an esteemed and very experienced panel. First we have Dr. Manish Singh, who is the executive director of Netralyum in Kolkata, and he has represented most of the societies and has been an office bearer in many societies like GSI and OSWB. And he is very well experienced in dealing with all the difficult glaucomas, and his presentations are also a pleasure to attend. So we are looking forward to his comments for these interesting cases we have. We also have on panel Dr. Sri Priya, who we know as Dr. AVS, and you can please change the slide. And I don't think she needs any introduction. All of us have learned surgery from her. So, welcome, ma'am, and we look forward to your comments on both the cases.
Thank you, Dr. Man.
Next, we have Dr. Nivedita Narayan. She's a senior consultant in the cataract surgery and the cornea refractive surgery department, and she's also the deputy director of accreditation, safety, and quality assurance of the hospital. She did her PACO training and cornea and refractive training in Shankar Nethralaya and FRCS also. And she's well experienced in dealing with all these complicated refractive cases, which we'll be discussing ahead. So we look forward to her comments. So with that, I will. We also have Dr. Shikha Basi, who will give special comments on the neuro-ophthalmological aspect of our cases, and she's the director of neuro-ophthalmology at Shankar Nethralaya. So we'll start with the first presentation, and I request Dr. Forum to share her slides.
Ma'am, am I audible?
Yeah.
May I start, please?
Yes, please.
Good evening, everyone. It is my extreme pleasure and privilege to be able to present before all my teachers and seniors here today. Usually we put this slide in the end, but I think when it comes to presenting in front of SN teachers and presenting things taught by them, I deeply feel that I should thank all of you first for teaching us so well and for encouraging us and supporting us all throughout. I would be sharing a case which tested both the patient's and my nerves. So a 15-year-old male child came to our OPD a year and a half back. He had complained of painless dimness of vision in his right eye since 3 months. He was diagnosed with glaucoma elsewhere and was referred for second opinion. He had Googled a bit and had many questions in his mind, and he seemed very anxious. The primary surgeon had got done his HRT and fields, as you can see. The child had not started any anti-glaucoma medications before he came to us. So on examination, there was a right-sided portwine stain. His best corrected visual acuity in the right eye was 6 by 12, left eye was 6 by 6. His IOP on applanation was 44 in the right eye, 16 in the left. PACI was 520 and 524 respectively. His right eye had episcleral hemangiomas, a clear and normal cornea. His AC was deep and lens was clear. On gonioscopy, the angles opened up to the spur and there was blood in the Schlemm's canal. The disc showed advanced cupping. There was no choroidal hemangiomas. We even did a B scan for him and confirmed. His left eye was absolutely normal. He had no history of seizures. His contrast enhanced MRI brain was normal. So with a diagnosis of Sturge-Weber syndrome type 2 glaucoma, we started him on topical anti-glaucoma medications. The IOP remained uncontrolled on maximum medications, which included travoprost and timolol combination once a day, brimonidine, brinzolamide combination twice a day, and etacityl eye drops at night, and oral Diamox. So in spite of all my efforts, the IOP didn't budge. So I had to finally take the decision of intervening surgically for him. As we all know, surgeries in patients of Sturge-Weber's syndrome is very complex. So we had a detailed discussion with the parents. I even gave him the option of going to SN, but they decided to stay with me. He had his board exams after a few weeks, so we kept him in under close observation till then. He started preparing for his board exams, and I started preparing for mine. Uh, After his exams were over, he came to us, and finally the surgery was planned. He was started on oral propranolol uh, 1 week before the surgery, and I did a trap plus MMC with under LA with all precautions. So on first post-op day, his uncorrected visual acuity was 6 by 18. His IOP was 10. The bleb was large, and that didn't give me a very good feeling. But luckily, the AC was formed, releasables were intact, and the CDLs was negative. So I put him on topical steroids, antibiotics, and cycloplegics. The oral propranolol was continued. On the fifth day, the much dreaded complication happened. He came with a vision of 2 by 60. His IOP was 6. The bleb was now looking larger than what it looked on the first day. The CDLs was negative, AC was shallow. The choroidal effusion was noted, so I gave him a large BCL, put him on oral steroids. Propranolol was continued, and I observed him closely. By day 18, his vision improved. His IOP was 12. Choroidal effusion also resolved almost completely. His AC had deepened, so we took off the VCL, and the steroids were tapered fast, and propranolol was still continued. At 8 weeks post-op, he had got his board results. He had done very well, and I had got mine. His uncorrected visual acuity was 6 by 12. IOP was 10. The bleb was diffuse. AC was deep. There was no choroidal effusion. I weaned him off the oral propranolol and the cycloplegics. So this is at 10 months post-op. Both of us are happy now. He's doing absolutely fine, preparing to become an engineer, and has been under a regular follow-up. His IOP continues to remain 12 without any anti-glaucoma medications, and his posterior segment is also absolutely okay. So Sturge-Weber syndrome is a phacomatosis. It is an encephalotrigeminal angiomatosis. The incidence is 1 per 50,000 live births. It is sporadic, non-hereditary. The male to female ratio is equal. It is usually unilateral. The somatic mutation in the GNAQ gene leads to abnormal development of capillaries in the skin, brain, and eyes. As per recent studies, the GNA11 and GNB2 genes are also involved. The cutaneous manifestations can be port wine stain, which occurs due to the facial cutaneous vascular malformations along the first and the second division of trigeminal nerve. The neurological manifestations include ipsilateral leptomeningeal angiomatosis, seizures, and mental retardation. The ocular manifestations include hemangiomas. Hemangiomas could be of the lid, conjunctiva, episclera, and choroid. Glaucoma affects almost 30 to 70% patients of Sturge-Weber syndrome. In patients where both upper and the lower lid are involved, the risk of developing glaucoma is 50% higher. Glaucoma in these patients shows a bimodal presentation. The first peak is at a very early age, between 0 to 2 years of life. It comprises of about 60% of total glaucoma cases in such children. And the main mechanism here is trabeculodysgenesis, while the second peak occurs in almost 40% cases, and the raised episcleral venous pressure is the culprit. Sturge-Weber syndrome can be classified into 3 types. It is known as the Roth scale. The first type is the classic type, which is most common form, featuring both port wine stain, leptomeningeal angiomas, and often accompanied by glaucoma. So basically, all three, the entire triad is seen in the first type. In the second type, port wine stain is seen and glaucoma is almost always there. but there is no leptomeningeal angioma or brain involvement. So no neurological involvement here, just the skin and the eye. And the third type, it has just the brain involvement, that is isolated leptomeningeal angiomas without any port wine stain and rarely any glaucoma. It is usually diagnosed via brain imaging. Neuroimaging here is very interesting. As I was preparing for this child, I read a bit and found out that the contrast enhanced MRI is the investigation of choice here. However, in early infancy, that is in first 3 months, it can often be false negative. Also, the changes seen in this age in children with Sturge-Weber syndrome are often vague, like intracranial calcifications, cerebral atrophy, white matter abnormalities, along with a developmental delay. So all these put together often arouse the suspicion of torch infection. As we discussed earlier, seizures are quite common in Sturge-Weber's, especially in the first year of life. But the maximum occurrence of seizures is between 6 to 9 months. So again, for the first 6 months, there are no seizures. And then if there is MRI is also negative, then there is no reason for the pediatrician or parents to suspect anything abnormal in the child. So often such children get missed, and then they start developing seizures, and at times these seizures which start occurring all of the sudden are not treated well, and it causes hypoxic damage in the brain, which leads to permanent mental retardation in the children. So it is very important that repeat MRI should be done at 9 to 12 months in case of high clinical suspicion. Leptomeningeal enhancement, often unilateral, cortical or subcortical changes in the parieto-occipital region are usually suggestive of Sturge-Weber syndrome. Pathognomonic signs like tram-type appearance are appreciated better on CT scan than MRI, and usually after 1 year of age. Also, a good thing is that if there are no neurological symptoms, no seizures, and a normal MRI after 1 year of age, it is unlikely that they will develop any neurological involvement in future. So the crux is that all the children for first 6 months, whenever a doctor is suspecting, the pediatrician is suspecting Sturge-Weber in the child, they should inform the parents that child can develop seizures at any time. There should be close follow-ups. Also, the pediatricians should make parents aware of the fact that the child is likely to develop glaucoma in the infancy, and if not in the infancy, maybe in the adolescent age also. So they need lifelong follow-up with the pediatrician and ophthalmologist. So management of Sturge-Weber syndrome can be medical or surgical. In the early onset type, medical management has a limited role. However, it helps in older children. PG analogs are the drug of choice, but we can keep adding other topical anti-glaucoma medications as required. Surgery is often needed. Choice of surgery depends on the age at presentation. Usually for younger children, it's trap plus trap. Trap plus MMC and GDD can be done for older children. Why is the surgery so complex and dreaded? It is because that the risk of extensive choroidal effusion, expulsive choroidal hemorrhage, exudative RD, profuse intraop bleeding, hypotony, and shallow AC are very common. Also, because of the high vascularity in the eye, the risk of surgical failure is also high. What all precautions we can take? Preoperatively, we should try to keep the IOP as low as possible. We can do that by giving IV mannitol, tablet Dimox, and anti-glaucoma medications. We can do it under GA. And if we are doing under LA, we need to give good massage. Intraoperative hypotony should be avoided by using AC maintainer, doing slow paracentesis, using visco, using pre-placed sutures, putting tight releasables, putting extra releasables. Also, it is important to do a good cautery. Post-operatively, these children need a closer monitoring. Also, we should start cycloplegics right from the beginning. The most important thing that I learned about operating these children is the use of perioperative propranolol. Propranolol is a non-selective beta-adrenergic receptor antagonist. It has been used for infantile cutaneous hemangiomas for quite some time now. It is known to cause vasoconstriction, induction of apoptosis in proliferating capillary endothelial cells, and it is also said to reduce VEGFs to some extent, and that's how it helps in these children. Usually, it is given in a dose of 2 milligram per kg in 2 divided doses, and it can be started 1 week before the surgery and continued 6 weeks post-op after operating clearance from physician. Some children might not be able to tolerate such a dose, so we can start with half dose, or we can start with 1 milligram or as much as the child tolerates. Also, the heart rate should be monitored at home. After COVID, all of us have pulse ox at home, so we can ask the parents to check the child's pulse every day. If it drops below 60, or if the child develops dizziness or any uneasiness, it should be reported immediately, and then we can stop propranolol. Fortunately, this boy didn't have any adverse effects because of propranolol. Also, it comes in 10 milligram, 20 milligram tablets. So they are small tablets, and we can give 2 tablets in the morning, 2 tablets at night, and doesn't cause much of a problem. As being ophthalmologists, we are quite apprehensive about giving systemic medications. Fortunately, I have an in-house cardiologist in form of my husband and in-house pediatrician in form of my brother. So they said it is okay, and that is how I gave the child this, and it really helped me. So the take-home message is, Sturge-Weber's, they say, is all about angiomas, but the bigger culprit is the lurking glaucoma. Nab that rogue at the first dialogue. For adolescent onset, start with a PG analog. When drugs fail to control those rising millimeters of mercury, brace yourself for the much dreaded surgery. When nerves are under pressure, perioperative propranolol should be the preferred measure. Let the disease know your might. Don't forget to make those releasables a bit tight. The mark scars the face. Let it not scar the vision. Multidisciplinary collaboration is a must on this mission. As you treat the patient, don't forget to heal the soul. Not missing glaucoma in these patients should be our collective goal. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Forum, for that interesting presentation and a well-managed case. So I'd like to ask the, I was going to ask you about the dose of the propranolol, but can you just repeat it once to just clarify what dose you gave? And then I'll also like to ask our panelist, Dr. Manish, whether they give propranolol in all cases or in only selective where they have a choroidal hemangioma or a more extensive port-wine stain.
I think nowadays we have started using propranolol for all cases which have choroidal hemangioma. If there are no choroidal hemangioma and we are not suspecting those cases, we don't use propranolol. But this is a very nice presentation by Dr. Forum. And last few years, once these studies came with propranolol, it definitely helped a lot in treating these studies, because post-operative effusion is a very serious complication, and she was lucky that the chamber was formed. A lot of cases you can have flat chamber on day 1, day 3, and they are very tricky to manage because a lot of these are pediatric patients. Taking them back to operation theatre, again forming the empty chamber is easier said than done. Also, an important thing is that these type of cases should always be taken in a proper setup where you have all the disciplines available. Sometimes you even require a sclerotomy, drain the choroidals if the entry chamber is flat for a very long time, and you have a risk of corneal decompensation or permanent peripheral synechia formation. Pre-op counseling is extremely important. You have to discuss, even if you're using propranolol, you should tell all the possible complications, and the patient may require multiple surgery. That has to be convinced to these patients. And as I think Dr. Forum has already mentioned, propranolol is not a very simple drug. It has cardiac side effects. So, and these pediatric patients, we are not qualified enough to understand their ECG or their cardiac status. So always take a clearance from the pediatrician. The dose is 2 milligram per kg, but we had a few cases where pediatrician has asked us to use 1 milligram per kg, and we have followed the pediatrician advice. That is very important for us. I'll just share one interesting case which I 2-3 years back presented in a Shankaracharya alumni meet also. We had a patient that time, the concept was just coming about using propranolol and we had not used it. And we did a AGB on third or fourth day, the AC was flat. So initially we thought it was a malfunctioning AGB. So we went ahead, formed the entry chamber with Helon, used intraluminal stenting with the vital suture. Still the AC remained flat. That time we thought of starting propanol. So ideally propanol should be started 1 week, but in that case we started after 7-10 days, and still luckily it worked, and within 3 to 4 days the chamber started to form. So propanol definitely should be used in these type of cases if you are suspecting for effusion, even as prophylactic.
So how long do you continue the propranolol then post-op period?
See, once you have started and you see the post-operatively, you don't have, the study has mentioned clearly to use for 6 weeks, but we generally use for a month.
Okay. And with the monitoring like she suggested.
Yeah, pulse rate monitoring is very important. And we do have a multi-specialty hospital close to our hospital. So we do tell the patient to go for a follow-up. Anyway, most of these patients are pediatric patients, so we are operating on the general anesthesia. So a lot of these patients do take a pediatrician clearance before surgery.
Yeah. So another point which I wanted to discuss was the role of a prophylactic sclerotomy or a sclerectomy. Again, I would like your opinion and then Dr. Sripriya's opinion on that. Do you do it in all, or would you would it be a sclerotomy or a sclerectomy, or when do you do it?
So initially what we used to do, if pre-operatively you are seeing an effusion existing and then you are planning a surgery, we always used to do a prophylactic sclerotomy, 4 to 6 millimeter behind the limbus. But if the pre-existing effusion is not there, then we will not doing. Now with the use of propranolol, we are not doing prophylactic sclerotomy unless there is a lot of choroidal effusion, and we have discussed with our VR colleague and they feel there is a high risk of effusion, then only we do it. Most cases we are not doing. And all those precautions which Dr. Forum was mentioning, like avoiding sudden collapse of chamber, maybe putting I have never used the anti-chamber maintenance, but I do sometimes use a little amount of viscoelastic material in the eye to avoid sudden collapse. Taking pre-placed suture is very, very important. You have to save the time in that crucial juncture. Go for a tighter closure. All these things, if you take most cases, you can get away.
Dr. Sripriya,
Yeah,
I would like
very
your
nice presentation for us. An excellent job also. Such a tension, just to take up a baby at any age with Sturge burst. And your presentation was also very nice. Ended with a very pretty poem. And we are envious of your teammates, pediatrician and so one thing.
Cardiologist are envious of my teachers, ma'am. I really tried my best to send him to SNI with all my might, but then they said, "Nahi, humko idhar hi karwana hai." Then I had no choice to.
And we are very happy to have such patients who don't want to come. This only one thing I wanted to add was the use of prostaglandin analogs, because in Sturge-Weber syndrome, one of the things they say is because it increases the uveal scleral outflow, it can cause, there are reports of massive uveal effusion with prostaglandin usage, especially if they have a choroidal hemangioma. So they say avoid prostaglandin analogs because here it's the outflow that is going to be, I mean, the production that's going to be more, apart from the angle closure component. So that's
and also
one
regarding
point.
the post-op shallow AC, I would like your comments. Would you use a BCL with the overfiltering?
No, correct. These things are just effusion, and it's BCL is actually not necessary at all. It will anyway take about a week or sometimes even 2 weeks to reform, and it's like obstetrics, masterly inactivity. Just keep watching and praying. That's all. And oral steroids and cycloplegics, atropine helps, and it spontaneously forms on its own. Sclerotomies, you do it in those eyes where you have a choroidal hemangioma, and so you're expecting something to for the fluid to drain. If the choroidals are massive, then it helps. But actually, because it is more an uveal scleral, the choroidal hemangiomas that are secreting more, there is whether you do sclerotomy or not, the effusion is going to come and it is going to spontaneously resolve. And in children, the choroidals do resolve faster than adults, even on a average basis.
Yeah,
But
true.
and many times you have so much of vascular malformations on the outer surface also. When you open the conjunctiva to look at the sclerotomy site. So
So how much mitomycin would you use? It's very vascular, but it's a child and probably with a
yes,
higher axial length. So how
good
much
question.
mitomycin do you use?
Good question. Maybe the same 1 minute because
Okay, Manish.
I'll agree with Madam. 0.4 for 1 minute. I generally use 0.4 for 1 minute, except in cases like uveitis and uveitis glaucoma. And these vascular malformations, interestingly, they look very scary when you open the conjunctiva, but they don't bleed that much as you
exactly
expect them to be. But they
very
look
true.
very scary. You have really thick ones. And Dr. Forum has mentioned everything, but one more thing I think, I don't know whether she has mentioned or not, about the ROCK inhibitors also have a good role in these cases because
Yes.
they do decrease your epistylial venous pressure. So in case you're planning medical management, you can give it a try with ROCK inhibitors also.
Yeah, she
Sometimes
had
She
put
had
the patient
Natars.
on Netello.
Natar was there. I think Dr. Arif is online, so we can ask about the retinal aspect if he can hear us. Dr. Arif is there? No. Okay. So, Dr. SRB, ma'am, we'd like to ask you about the
And
neurophil aspect of it because she's mentioned that the imaging keeps changing and we need to follow up. So, what is your take on that?
Yeah, so in Sturge Weber, no, basically what is happening is the main concern is the seizures in children. There are three types she did describe, no? So the first and the third type, in that you will have CNS problem abnormalities. The second type, you might just have, ocular cutaneous this thing Sturge Weber, that is angiomas, and the glaucoma part of it. Now, the main thing, two things are there here. One is because of the leptomeningeal angiomas, and also because of the brain angiomas, because of the irritation of the angioma, the child might develop seizures. The second thing is there is something called a steal phenomenon occurring around it, and the patient might get stroke like symptoms. So when that occurs, it is like a because of the vascular steal phenomenon. If it is in occurring in the occipital lobe, the person might develop transient hemianopia. So, we usually don't hear about this transient homonymous hemianopias. This is one condition where the patient can have, recurrent transient hemianopias, which then, become permanent if it keeps occurring again and again. So there are two things, and these patients, once you've diagnosed the patient to have this Sturge-Weber syndrome clinically, then it's a must that at the first go, neuroimaging should be done, because these seizure disorders can be very difficult to treat. They can become intractable. There are cases where patients have had surgery, brain surgery, part of brain is removed, where they're not able to control the seizures. And cases where there is no glaucoma and there is no cutaneous these port wine stains and all. In these cases, the patient just might present with seizures, and on retrospect, in brain forum very nicely presented that what you see is initially, the MRI may not pick it up. In cases, functional MRI, may be required earlier on. If you're not able to pick it up, maybe till the age of 5, probably. They say after 5, the neurological thing kind of settles down. Till then, maybe a serial neuroimaging should be done. So the children can present with the main neuro. If you're seeing a child of Sturge Weber syndrome, The other concerns that from neurology point of view are there, that these patients might require anti-epileptics. These patients are prone to stroke because of the venous spaces and thrombosis. So they might need to be, if these things are seen in the CNS is involved, then they might need to be started on aspirin. So stroke protocol, I mean, like to prevent the stroke. And these children could be getting bad headaches, migraine kind of bad headaches. And the fourth thing is that they'll have developmental delay. The more you delay the seizure treatment, the poor control of seizure is there, and more recurrent these stroke like episodes are there, they'll have a permanent deficit. So it's important that you pick it up and then put these children to the neurologist. Very nice presentation, Forum.
So you are
Poem
saying
summed
that
it all, I think.
MRI, you will suppose it's a patient who's just come with a port vein stain. Otherwise, they don't have any. So, would you just tell the parents to be aware, or do you still have to
No,
do
no,
one
get
baseline
an
MRI?
Get an MRI done, because it's only on. I mean, like, how do you make out that it's the one or three? I think it's only clinical kind of classification. As a protocol, you do the neuroimaging.
Okay. And what
CT
is your
scan pick up the
experience?
calcification too. At times, Veena will do a few cuts to pick up the this thing CT cuts to pick up the calcification.
What's your experience on that GNAQ mutation? Whether, because they say that that is only associated with the leptomeningeal hemangiomas. Do we
Yeah,
have
that is
any
it. Is
tests done for our
not really.
patients?
No, Priya. This is the recently thing, no, that we have picked up the gene for it. Uh, but we haven't. In fact, I mean, like, I don't see that many Sturge Webers being referred to neuro-ophthalmology, sadly.
We routinely do
Because
genetic
it's going, it's
analysis.
probably, see, there is no unless the person has a homonymous hemianopia because of the lesion in the occipital lobe, it doesn't come to us. So it's at the level of glaucoma consultant that it's your duty either to put it. It's not direct neuro-ophthalmology, but there is definitely neurology there. So maybe awareness. I mean, like, you can run them through a neurologist. In all probability, the child looked quite. I think there was no neurological deficit in your patient. Had good this thing. There were no developmental delay or any this thing mental retardation in your
No, no,
patient, I
no, ma'am.
believe.
About
He was a brilliant
95%.
student. He scored very well in his boards. In fact, his
Yes.
MRI also,
So
though he was
probably it was
taking.
the type 2.
Yes, yes. So his MRI also, he nobody had ever got his MRI done. It was only before planning for the surgery, just for documentation and to know what's happening in the brain. We got a MRI done. Till then, there was no workup about Sturge Weber's ever.
Dr. Manish, do you image all your patients for Sturge Weber, or only selected number one?
See, there's no indication for him to image. It's not like, not the glaucoma consultant has no, I mean, like, there's no indication from a side. Probably can put this is the diagnosis and put to the pediatric neurologist that needs the evaluation. This is the diagnosis. Unless there is some homonymous hemianopia or there's history of seizures or something.
Shika madam has mentioned, because these patients don't really go to neuro. They go from a glaucoma doctor to a pediatrician or a neurologist. This is between, we advise them to consult if the pediatrician advises them to go for an MRI.
So I think that was an excellent discussion. So with that, I will go on to the next case by Dr. Vimal Pandit, who will be presenting from Abu Dhabi actually.
So, good evening again. Good evening, respected teachers, seniors, and dear colleagues. It's always a privilege to be a part of the SN meeting, and a big thank you to Mona ma'am for having me on board for today's Power Wow session. I'll just quickly begin my slide sharing. So, beginning with my today's case, he is a 32-year-old male, a high myope, who underwent a bilateral ICL implantation last year in India. And he presented to me 2 months back with the complaints of dimness of vision in his left eye for 3 months. So basically, this guy is an expat in the UAE, and probably he has never returned back to his primary operating surgeon after the first post-operative week follow-up. So during his first visit, the best corrected vision in the right eye was 6.9 and in the left eye was 6.12, and the near vision also did not improve more than N10. The IOP in the right eye was 24 and in the left eye was 38 with a thin cornea. So these are the slit lamp images of the right eye. As we see here, the anterior chamber depth is pretty shallow. It was less than 2 millimeters. And this was basically the ICL 4C model and V4C model. And it had a central aqua port, which was nicely seen in the undilated state, and it was noted to be freely patent. Upon dilatation, what we saw was numerous pigments on the anterior surface of the ICL, and the lens was clear. Coming on to the left eye, again, the anterior chamber was pretty much shallow with a depth of less than 2 millimeters. The central aqua port was freely patent. When we dilated the left eye, we noted dense pigmentation on the anterior surface of the ICL, and this was more dense than what we noted in the right eye. And this eye had a visually significant cataract as well. Gonioscopy for both the eyes. In all the quadrants, no structures were seen, even post-indentation. Coming on to the fundus evaluation, both these eyes had average to large sized disc, and the right eye had a cup disc ratio of 0.6 with very early infratemporal thinning, while the left eye we could clinically see inferior thinning along with early superior thinning. And there was one more surprise element in the fundi of both the eyes, that was this bilaterally symmetrical looking macular lesion, probably a macular dystrophy. So investigating further, the OCT, RNFL, both the eyes showed an inferior RNFL thinning, which fairly correlated with the disc changes. The macular scan showed GCC thinning, and also if we look here, there was an outer retinal thinning noted in both the eyes at the level of fovea, which correlates with the suspected clinical macular dystrophy. So coming on to the ASOCT examination, so this is just a representative image of one quadrant. We did the scanning for all 12 clock hours to see what was the vault of the ICL, and in all the quadrants, the vault was noted to be more than 1000 microns. As we can see here, this is the posterior, the ICL mark hyperreflectivity that we see here, and this is the lens, and we have measured the vault is more than 1000 microns. And a similar picture was also noted in the left eye. This again is a representative image of one clock hour. Coming on to the visual field examination, in the right eye, the foveal threshold was subnormal and mainly central defects were seen, again, mostly because of the macular lesion. And in the left eye, the 24-2, again, the foveal thresholds were subnormal. And the 24-2 showed a generalized depression, which didn't much correlate with the disc changes. And a 10-2 again had a central defect. So based on the history and examination, my provisional diagnosis for this case would be a bilateral combined mechanism secondary glaucoma. The major component being the angle closure part, which is a posterior pushing mechanism, basically because of the high vault. No pupillary block mechanism is seen here because the central aqua port is freely patent in both the eyes, along with a pigment dispersion component and a bilateral macular dystrophy and a cataract in the left eye. So not a very pleasant scenario. Coming on to the discussion, the design of the ICL has evolved over the years. And with the evolution in the design, we have also seen a progressively lesser number of complications. So starting with the earlier designs where there was no central port for the aqueous flow, and these cases we need to do a preoperative prophylactic LPIs, and now mostly they prefer the ICL with a central aqua port, which eliminates the need to put the prophylactic PI. However, it has been reported in the literature that even with the sophisticated models, a number of complications are noted, and the most dreaded and of which is a glaucoma. So the mechanisms of glaucoma can be several. The most common open angle mechanisms in the early postoperative period is the retained viscoelastic, which is not very difficult to deal with. Then a steroid response, again because these are high myopes and they have a natural inherited susceptibility, a lot of them, to have steroid response. Pigment dispersion is also very, very common. And any kind of chronic iritis can also lead to an inflammatory trabeculitis. So these are the common open angle mechanisms. And coming on to the angle closure mechanism, I would like to divide them into two categories, the non-pupillary block and the pupillary block. Now, the pupillary block is the most commonly encountered, and even if there has been a prophylactic LPI pre-operatively, a lot of cases have been reported for the earlier models where the PI got obliterated and then the patients suddenly presented with a angle closure. And the same goes with the modern ICLs with a central aqua port. There have been reports in the literature where this aqua port have been obliterated by pigments or membranes mostly, and then suddenly an acute angle closure attack begins. So these are the pupillary block mechanism. And the non-pupillary block mechanism, as in our case, was the one which is caused by a high volt ICL, which basically pushes the iris forward and causes an angle closure by a posterior pushing mechanism. And not very common, but aqueous misdirections have also been reported in the literature. So basically, vault is the distance between the posterior surface of the IOL and the anterior surface of the natural lens. And the optimum range is between 250 to 750 microns. So any vault which is more than 750 microns is tagged as a high vault. And it has been seen that mostly an intervention in terms of redialing or exchange or explantation of the ICL is required if the vault exceeds 1000 microns. Now, this is an interesting meta-analysis which has looked at various studies where a central port design have been used. They've looked at the effectiveness and the safety, and this was a meta-analysis of roughly 10,000 cases. And what they inferred was the incidence of experiencing a high vault was approximately 0.5%, even when standard formulae were used by the surgeon. And the incidence of a secondary intervention in terms of a realignment or exchange because of the high vault was very low, almost 0.1%. Now, there are several factors which can affect the vault: the size of the ICL, the anterior chamber depth, crystalline lens rise, angle kappa, the configuration of the iris, the surgical technique, postoperative position, and the natural lens movement. And three factors which are most important are the size, the ICL size, anterior chamber depth, and the CLR. So it has been noted that mostly the vaulting issues, the high vault issues, come when there is an oversized ICL and the preoperative anterior chamber depth is more. It's a deeper AC. Bigger question, how to prevent the high vault? So of course, whenever we are planning any ICL, precise preoperative measurements, the wide to wide, the sulcus to sulcus, ATA, all of these are very, very important. And we must not rely just on a single modality for our calculations. Mostly surgeons prefer two or more modalities, mostly the UBM and the anterior segment OCT in combination, to get an idea of the sulcus to sulcus and the WTW distance. So preoperative calculations have to be very, very precise. If possible, an intraoperative use of OCT assisted ICL can always help achieve the ideal vault. And once the implantation is done, also regularly you need to look at the vault because it can keep on changing, and the best way is to rely on an ASOCT or UBM if you have it at your disposal. So now coming back to my case, so for this particular patient, of course, at the first visit, we started him on anti-glaucoma medications, and on the IOP did come down to a good range after starting medications. But for this particular patient, I was not expecting a very good compliance. The big reason being that the availability of AGMs or any medications per se here depend a lot upon the type of insurance card that you hold, very sadly. And if you are going to buy the medications in cash, it is going to be very, very expensive. So definitely for this particular patient with not so good insurance by his employer, I was not expecting a very good compliance. He was also not ready to travel back to India and meet the primary operating surgeon. So definitely something more concrete needs to be done for him in order to safeguard the vision. And the surgery for this particular patient is still pending. So now I would like to open this case for discussion in front of our esteemed panelists and mentors, so as to how to go about this case. So for the right eye, the options that we can look at is number one is an ICL explantation. But the biggest drawback for this option is that again then the patient will have to wear the spectacles, because the left eye already has a cataract, so anyhow we'll remove the cataract and put the lens. So then, and if you do an explantation for the right eye, then the charm of the initial surgery is going to go, at least for the patient. So the next option is an ICL exchange, continuing the medical therapy. Or if we are planning to do an ICL exchange, we might expect more manipulation and the glaucoma to worsen and do something more concrete in terms of a trap. So these are the options I am looking at for the right eye. And for the left eye, definitely, since there is a cataract, the ICL needs an explantation along with phaco. So should it be coupled with a filtration surgery? And if yes, should it be a single sitting surgery or it should be a staged procedure? Or just explant the ICL, do a phaco, and let him continue on the medical therapy. So I'm just opening the case for discussion now.
Okay. So before the panelists try to digest all your options, I would like to ask Dr. Nivedita that before implanting an ICL, to avoid these situations, how to get the best size and the best fit
Sure.
and the best vault.
I'm audible, Mona.
Yes.
Yeah, so excellent case presentation, Brinal. Very good discussion so far. Congratulations to all of you. So pertaining to this particular case, in my opinion, this case does not qualify for an ICL at all. Because if you look closer at the macula when the patient is having a maculopathy, no refractive correction is advisable, because anything is done in an otherwise normal macula. So if the patient had come to me, I would have definitely not opted for an ICL for this patient. So to make sure that you are in the right spectrum of sizing, the most important is, like she has already mentioned, white to white measurement is what is going to give you a guesstimate of your sulcus to sulcus distance. So we take the measurements in 3 different modalities. One, we use a pentacam, we use an ASOCT, we also use a UBM and an manual digital calipers. Okay, so we compare all of those things and usually they conform to each other. But the final number that we give for ICL selection is our digital calipers measurement only. So when there is a disparity between any of these, then it calls for a deeper thought. You can repeat once again, and if the discrepancy is consistent, then we'll have to warn the patient that there is going to be a surprise. To anticipate in every patient, like any refractive procedure, we advise the patient not to undergo simultaneously in both the eyes, precisely for this reason. Because even with the best of calculations, there is a possibility of mismatch, because naturally a wider white to white can have a shorter sulcus to sulcus distance and vice versa. This occurrence is somewhere less than 10% of population. So in those patients, even if you measure your white to white accurately, we are going to have a surprise. So taking that into consideration, ICL is only done one eye at a time. The subsequent eye is postponed to a week. So I have had patients with 1000 volt in my first eye, and I have sized it down in the other eye and done the other eye. Then I have reached a reasonable volt. And then I have told the patient, see, we have resized and your first eye has to be removed. And within a month, we have removed the first eye and put the proper size. Okay, so this is how it is done. It is always better to go one step extra to be on the safe zone rather than do and then have this problem. High vault is an issue, and some patients will have a very deep AC. In those, even 800 plus vault will still be an open angle and no IOP. So it is not just the number, it is the total factor which is to be taken into account when we deal with these kind of patients. Suppose this patient come to me today with a high vault and a maculopathy, under pressure spike, and a cataract in one eye. My advice will be to only remove the ICL first, because that is what is causing the major problem of spike in IOP under optic nerve damage. So remove the ICL and see how your IOP is working. So you can take it as a trial in the right eye which doesn't have cataract. And then when the IOP comes down with the ICL removal alone, you know that the second eye can undergo either combined or just ICL removal. Understand? I hope I have answered the question.
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, one more question is when you're removing the viscoelastic, a lot of cases have been reported where the viscoelastic blocks the central aquaport. So, what is your technique to remove the viscoelastic to avoid that?
So, in general, using minimum viscoelastic is important. So, that holds good for ICL also. If somebody watches my surgery, they will see that the lens implantation is very fast, but removing the viscoelastic takes longer. It's literally true because the port is very small. The OVD is locked behind the ICL. Now, through that small OVD, the port, and the side areas where there is a little gap, only the OVD has to escape. So you have to be patient. You have to look for the fluid wall underneath the ICL, just like how we see in the IOL. Underneath the bag close to the PC, you see the water visco ends coming closer to each other, and then at one point that visco is completely washed. The same thing happens here also. So we have to be patient. You have to keep your IA port close to the aqua port and slowly aspirate. There is no shortcut in that.
Thank you for the wonderful tips, ma'am.
And you use high molecular weight viscoelastic only, or you prefer a viscodispersive?
I prefer a viscodispersive. I don't.
Okay.
I don't go for any.
You use HPMC, right?
Yeah. Yes.
So now I'd like to ask.
Another one important thing is the vault can change post-operatively. A shallow vault can become a little bit more, and a higher vault can gradually subside. This is because of two factors. A shallow vault increasing is because as the aqueous flow sets in, and because you are sucking so much, so you are only leaving minimal aqueous to be behind. So as the aqueous secretion sets in, everything normalizes and the ICL is able to assume its position. So that is one. The another thing is where the haptic leg sits. It has got 4 footage. So where these footage sits will also alter. So there are 3 different positions in front of the sulcus, exactly in the sulcus, a little bit beyond. So based on that, the vault size can be variable. So that also gets slightly adjusted and finally it takes its position. So somewhere around 1 month only you will know exactly what is the vault.
So do you
wait for a month to see how it goes?
Do you have anything that you place it horizontal or vertical, anything like that?
It cannot sit vertical because a horizontal space is the widest.
Okay.
And we also make a temporal incision only so that it is easy to just
slide it in.
So in case of a toric ICL, sometimes you may have to rotate it because you cannot have all axis in the armamentarium. So the maximum rotation allowed is 20 degrees each clock and anti-counterclockwise. So you'll have to choose something within that span. So you cannot make the ICL vertical.
Okay. Very valid point. And when you're explanting the ICL, aren't you so scared that behind you have a clear phaco sitting there?
No,
How
no.
does it?
In a
You just
well
pinch it
dilated,
and it'll come out, or
yes, it's easy. It is a highly flexible.
yeah, implantation. I've seen it so
It's very,
delicate.
very flexible.
It's like a contact
It's
lens.
easy to damage it. Okay,
Okay.
it's easy to damage it. So you can put the OVD, keep a good sandwich for the capsule, and gently lift it up beyond the iris. So once it is on the iris, you can manipulate whichever way you want. Sometimes you'll be so surprised if you get one foot plate out, and if you have a good grasp, hand over hand, you can just pull it through a 2.7 millimeter incision itself. So that how flexible it is, it rolls and comes out. This is star ICL, not ICRL. The Indian version is little rigid. There you need to extend.
Dr.
Ma'am, I had-
Manish, answer to one of the.
I had one
Yes.
more question for NVN, ma'am.
Yes,
Okay.
yes,
Ma'am,
ma'am.
Okay,
Thank
then.
you so much for all the inputs. I had one question. Would you opt for an ICL in a case where in a high myopic patient preoperatively if you find a ciliary body cyst? Is it an absolute contraindication or
No,
you
no.
would still consider?
What I routinely do, I'll tell you,
Mhm.
I will send the patient to glaucoma specialist.
We shared one case like that.
Yes. They will, so far, I think I have not seen them say no.
Okay.
So they can tell why they don't say no. So, but then the patient will come back. But definitely, I look for UBM and the cyst, and it is in our protocol. Our secretary also will know UBM Mandachi madam. There is a cyst glaucoma fix. So that we routinely do. So always better to play it safe.
Correct.
But I don't, unless there is major change, Mona can answer why we should not.
So I remember we had one case which had a slightly higher vault, a shallow AC, and the angles were kind of affordable to ATM, PTM. So we were following up for quite some time. The reason why, despite the proper sizing, was that it was sitting on one part was sitting on the area of the cyst. So I think ultimately we have decided to exchange that ICL, right, ma'am?
Yes. So
So after that,
when you have cyst, it is important to look where it is.
yeah.
So that if it is in the horizontal meridian, your positioning could be a problem. If it is in the vertical meridians, then it's so that aspect of it you need to look at.
Right.
Pigment dispersions happen very often. Even if a vault is 500, when the pupil constricts, the iris is going to rub against the ICL. So that will induce pigment epithelial dispersion to some extent. But it all settles down. But when there is a constant rubbing, excessive liberation, then you will have the closure and IUP spike.
So, Dr. Manish, your input on how to manage both the eyes.
Very nice points, madam, is highlighting, because since I don't do ICL, so my knowledge is a bit theoretical, and most of the glaucoma cases which we have seen are only steroid related IOP rise or sometimes retained viscoelastic. High vault, I haven't seen. One case I have seen, because we don't know so many ICLs. But very nice case, Dr. Lina. Lot of interesting discussion has come. What was the eye pressure on medications? The pressure which you have mentioned, 4 and 8. What was the pressure, final pressure on medication?
Sir, so for the right eye, I started a combination medication, dorzolamide timolol combination, and it came down to mid-teens. The left eye was still, during the first visit, if I remember, first visit after the starting AGM, it was with Travitin and Cosopt, it came down to high teens, around 18 to 20, with 3 medications.
But this was healthy, right?
This was, there was a dropping in left eye.
Yes, left eye did look glaucomatous, definitely. Right was
Yeah,
still.
right eye, I think, had early cupping, and left eye you had an inferior rim lock, isn't it?
Yes. Left
So,
was definitely.
Madam has mentioned, Nivita madam, that we can remove the ICL But very high possibility the left eye will ultimately require surgery because you already have glaucoma. Plus, even with free medicine, the pressure is a bit on the higher side and patient has extensive synechia formation. So we can go with the two-step procedure, remove the ICL, wait for a week or two or month to let the eye become a bit quiet, but tell the patient that finally you are going, and patient also has a cataract, so anyway that surgery will be required. So removing the ICL and then maybe second step cataract and glaucoma surgery can be planned for the left eye. But looking at the eye, left eye seems to be putting a new ICL may not be a great idea when already glaucoma has developed. I don't think I should probably skip the ICL part, just remove it and plan your glaucoma and cataract management.
If I can just add one point regarding the cataract formation post ICL, irrespective of how good the vault is, there is going to be a compromise in the nutrition for the lens. So some of the patients develop the anterior subcapsular opacities, but that is non-progressive and that is also not visually significant. So if it is a subcapsular cataract and the patient does not perceive a loss of vision, these patients can be still observed.
This one thing I thought was this patient, the vault being so high, and your slit lamp image is showing the mid iris onwards. It's
Yes,
like sort
the
of flattened out.
it's indent
So
seen.
your now you still have a pupillary block component because aqueous has to come through that port and come out. It's like a phacomorphic glaucoma. So your peripheral iridotomy is not going to help because the rest of it is completely across the iris, right? So the same mechanism will apply to such an anteriorly vaulted ICL.
Correct.
So I'm just thinking whether you can just do one giant surgical PI, because then you're taking care of this ICL iris contact and a goniosynovitis in the right eye, because now the angles are zipped up. So once you just doing a PI is not going to take care of the aqueous drainage out of the eye. So if you can do a goniosynovitis and a PI, you open up the angle and then you can give it a chance to see whether the pressures will normalize on its own. I think that will be the least invasive that you can do on the right eye, and being the lens being clear, that's a call you can take. And if left eye you can manage till the cataract progresses a little more, then you can take a call whether the left eye you just remove the lens and then do a goniosynovitis and take it step by step rather than straight to go for a trabeculectomy or for a ICL removal.
But in left eye, ma'am, definitely ICL we will not.
Yeah, when it comes to because the cataract image you showed, the right in the center doesn't look bad. With the maculopathy, you don't want to add any surgical CME and all. And the endothelial count we don't know because we have had high pressures and pigment dispersion and all going on for a long time.
Correct.
So how compromised that is, we do not know. With all that, these eyes definitely need. You can even just try a YAG iridotomy.
Okay.
Only thing I'm thinking of the compromised, the synechial closure.
Yes.
What do you think, Mona?
It may not work if the port is open, but it may cause additional pigment dispersion. That is one issue. With the UV,
if you want to do
whether there is a component of pupillary block, and then that may help decide whether a PI may work or not.
If you want to do an iridotomy, Mona, then the ICL, if it is horizontally placed, then vertical iridotomies only will be helpful.
But for the right eye, we can try iridotomy because the pressure, as she has mentioned, is controlled with through medication. So we can try iridotomy and right eye and just keep under close follow. Left eye, as she has planned to remove the ICL and then go with the
cataract surgery and goniosynovitis. Correct.
We cannot cause anisometropia. We have to think of that part also in these eyes because. And
so left eye, anyway, she's planning cataract surgery, so that will take care of.
That will take care. So cataract and angle surgery would be the first choice, and then a
Type
step
of synechia has formed in this case.
Whether
Renal, when was the surgery done? The initial surgery? How many years back?
it was done in early 2025, I think. Yeah. So
about
it's
a year.
almost been a year.
Just a year
More,
only.
yeah.
But the disc is reasonably healthy, so IOP spike must have been reasonably fresh,
Yes.
because we cannot have 30 plus pressures and such a healthy,
Yes.
apparently healthy disc with an early inferior thinning.
Correct.
So what is your usual post-op regimen? Because many of them are myopes and can be steroid responders. So post-op usually, what is your regimen in post-ICL, Dr. Nivedita?
No, steroid we give usually, but taper and stop.
With prednisolone, or you give a lotipred or something?
Lotipred.
Okay.
Usually, normally we give lotipred unless the traumatic surgery, you anticipate more inflammation, then for a short period we can give. But usually, multiple times the pupil getting caught or something, in the intraoperatively, then there is going to be inflammation. You want to start on steroid for the first week and then switch over to lotipred. Lotipred, taper and stop. 6, 4, 3, 2, 1.
So there are some case reports of doing TRAB with an ICL in situ, but those were patients who had a fairly AC depth was fairly good. So what is your take on that, Dr. Manish and Dr. Shripriya?
You were mentioning about doing a TRAB with ICL present.
In situ, because of the refractive issue, the patient doesn't want it to be removed.
I must say, I don't have a personal experience with this, but with such a shallow chamber, it would be really difficult to do a TRAB. And since the ICL is the culprit, and that is the reason which is causing the problem, at least for the left eye, I think we should consider removing it.
If the patient is that bothered, I think clear lens extraction with the trap rather than leave that ICL and suffer.
I think a proper counseling will convince the patient to understand which is more important, not wearing a glasses or becoming blind with glaucoma. So it's like they have to take a choice. A proper counseling will probably help them understand.
Many times we come across these patients, especially post VR surgeries with glaucoma, who have ICLs in situ. They don't want their ICLs to be removed. I did cataract in one where with post silicone oil removal. So the ICL itself had become so rigid. It was like, as Dr. Nivedita said, they come out very easily, but it took me half an hour to take out that ICL because it had become totally ground glass and rigid. So the patient was worried about his post-op vision, that because they are...
One tip I can give you, Mona, when you want to combine phaco with ICL removal, if you are a surgeon who normally sits superiorly, you can opt for a temporal. So that way, the ICL is in the same position. You don't have to plate. It's easy to come out, and it's in the maximum.
The ICL had changed actually, ma'am. It had become like rigid because of the oil, emulsified oil. So it was not.
But at least coaxial removal becomes easy.
Yeah, I understood.
Even this patient was so motivated to do anything but don't get my ICL.
Yeah.
Very tough guy to crack.
So do the PI and the goniosaniculasis.
Yeah. She was waiting for the power.
Yes. Now it becomes pretty much clear. So definitely, I think for the right eye, at least I can try a PI and see. Yes.
So many times when surgeons are putting ICL, glaucoma can be missed. It can be JOAG or I think pigment dispersion syndrome, where they already have pigment and that rubbing will cause more pigment. So it's important to rule out all this before I think going in for the ICL. That is very important.
Pre-operative glaucoma referral is what they should do.
Yeah.
Post-operative.
So you can tell your refractive colleagues.
Oh, no. The opening will become too heavy. No.
So I think any other comments?
Very,
regarding
very
the
interesting.
cases?
Thank you.
Nice case, Dr. Vijay.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
So I think we should thank all the panelists, Dr. Manish, Dr. Sri Priya, and Dr. Nivedita for taking their time out and sharing their experience with us. Dr. Reenal and Dr. Forum for presenting such interesting cases, and Dr. Shikha for her special comments, and all the audience for their participation, and of course Yashada and our multimedia team. So we
And
will-
Dr. Mona for stringing it together.
Yes.
So we look forward to meeting you at our next powwow next month. So we'll take a picture, I think. We'll stop
Whenever
sharing.
it's the SN panel on the this thing, you tend to read a lot. So it is just helping. I
Nice
never
to
knew
see
how
the
to measure the vault and
presentation.
everything, but then I read and then it has to be done in all the 12 quadrants. This is the way you do it. Otherwise, it's just like, okay,
You'll have to stop the screen
Stop
show
sharing,
if you
yeah.
want.
yes,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
okay,
We will just stop sharing.
yes, it's done.
Yeah.
Okay. So Dr.
It was
Mani,
really
this is
nice seeing the
an honor.
quality of the presentations also.
Thank you.
Just for